I'm Devin Kenny. I work for the Wyoming Attorney General's office. I've been there just over 8 years. So I have a couple of different clients that do procurement. The first one I have is the State Construction Department, and they actually do have some relevance here. But the other one is the Wyoming Stable Token Commission. You may or may not know what a stable token is. If you do, feel free to put your head down, take a little nap. In fact, if you're just not interested in crypto at all, I completely understand. I kind of got roped into this. Not into the presentation so much, that was technically a volunteer thing, but the representing a stable token, that was getting roped into. So a stable token is a type of digital asset that typically runs on a blockchain, but has a value pegged to a stable reference asset. So if you know a lot about cryptocurrency, you're probably like, could care less. If you know a little, you may have heard of like Bitcoin. It's sort of, in a lot of ways, a stable token is kind of like the opposite of like a Bitcoin. There are definitely similarities. They share some basic DNA. They both have the blockchain piece. But the idea behind a stable token is that you're taking what are the perceived positives of cryptocurrency and making it more stable. If you're aware of Bitcoin at all, what you may know, if you're just aware of it just a little bit, is that it fluctuates wildly. And the reason it does that is because it's not pegged to anything. There's no real-world asset between it. Its only value is whatever people perceive it as being, which I suppose one could technically say applies to currency, but generally we all agree that the dollar is worth something, so the value stays relatively stable. It's not the case with like a Bitcoin, for example. So what you do if you create a stable token is that you have some sort of asset, whether it's US dollars, that's a very typical one, could be euro, could be gold, could be some other commodity, but you tie whatever digital asset you're creating. In the case of the Wyoming stable token, they decided to call it the Frontier token, so the Frontier token, and you tie it to that reference asset so that it stays relatively stable. Wyoming's goal with the stable token is basically to kind of foster the market. We're sort of like we consider ourselves in some way to be the, like Delaware is always the front runner of like, different business things. We sort of like think of ourselves as being that version, but for digital assets on the high plains. We're the Delaware of the Middle West. So, my first slide. So, Wyoming created the Wyoming Stable Token Commission. The legislature did with a mandate to issue the first state-backed stable token. We hit a few walls, some of which are just related to, creating something that's entirely new that no state does. I won't so much talk about those, but the one for the purpose of here is we kind of hit a procurement wall, which is that we're procuring something that, yes, there are private companies involved in. There are certainly, various cryptocurrency entities, and there's a whole ecosystem of companies that support those. But none of those have ever worked with states. Or at least very few. There are some as to like maybe the security aspect or, like that can help investigators that those have, but none of the other ones they've never done any kind of government procurement at all. They're completely unfamiliar with it. And this is where like I take my, the procurement experience I had from working with, state construction where there are risks. I mean, there's risks involved in like every procurement, but the risks involved when you're building a building are very different. I'm going from a world where we're talking about, these are the contractors, the general contractors. We're talking about the design professionals. We're talking about bricks. We're talking about potentially having roof leaks or buildings having issues to, frankly, technical terms that I don't really understand. If you have a bunch of technical questions, don't ask them. I can't answer them. That somehow we have to make that work. We have to encourage folks who have never been involved in any kind of state procurements to try. We also have to deal with the fact that, again, if you have any general knowledge of cryptocurrency, you may have heard of, the various like, yes, there's the fluctuations and things like Bitcoin, but also, like new firms will arise and then they'll disappear, seemingly overnight. Sometimes there's fraud involved. Trying to avoid that sort of thing, avoid working with those that, that they may be the low bid contractors, but you have no idea what kind of expertise or even how you have a good way to evaluate their expertise. And also, like I said before, the fact that Wyoming wants to be the first, and so far is the first, means that there's really no one to base, there's some things we can look to and, existing traditional procurement or IT procurements and things like that, but there's nobody else that's doing what we're doing so far. And some people might be like, well, that might be a sign you shouldn't do it. But we never had that feeling. That's a thought that never crossed any legislator in Wyoming's mind. So it's trying to figure out how to pioneer this potentially new field, but still maintain the basic protections that are in place for good reason. So as we started working through and these things we came up with, I came up with for this, but we also just hit some issues. For example, like I mentioned before, like vendor qualifications, like who can you trust when the market is filled with, new potentially fly-by-night operators who, just created yesterday, or even existing ones. I mean, the thing is, honestly, you read the news and, the crypto news, which I would suggest you avoid, but if you do read it, you find that, a firm will have been operating for 5 years and then suddenly it just disappears overnight. It turns out that they were actually, stealing money the whole time, and you're like, so it can be difficult to know who can be trusted and how you can determine what level of trust to have. There's also the long-term tech risk. For example, I come from where we're looking at a building that will hopefully, cross your fingers, last for, decades, to going to these technology systems that, frankly, even if there's no issues with it, if the market simply moves on, if we want to create the stable token, we want people to use it, the idea is that the market will pick it up, even if there are no issues and just the market shifts to a different platform or a different way of doing things. We may need to shift with that, even if there are actually no issues, we didn't actually have a problem with what we were using, we may need to shift. Also just the question of making sure that we're complying with the existing procurement statutes. We did get, a degree of exception for a stable token, but still generally speaking, we have the same, bid limits, same, purchasing limits, things like that. Also the issue of perpetuity, blockchain, if you know something about it, the whole idea of why it's, perceived to be useful is that it's permanent, it's unchangeable, which is great and all, but what if the firm that we're working with, disappears, or we no longer, if we can't get access to it anymore, then whatever was on there may be lost forever, which, if somebody builds a building and they go out of business, if the building's built at least, if it's not, then that's a problem. But if the building is built, then we still have the building. It doesn't matter if the vendor disappears because the building still exists. That may not be the case with something that only exists, digitally. And then finally, just the, existing infrastructure that Wyoming has, that our procurement platform, which is public purchase, you may or may not be familiar with it. Simply, it didn't have any existing registrants that for the classes of the services that we were looking for, and the vendors that we wanted to work with, again, because they'd never been involved in state procurement, none of them were registered there, none of them were really aware of it, none of them were using it. And so how do we get the word out and making sure that we get the folks that we need to be interested? So we came up with a few solutions. Nothing's perfect, especially cryptocurrency. But to the first point, which is one of the bigger ones, how do we make sure that we're getting people who are truly qualified? we came up with a process of having a rolling application for pre-qualification, kind of similar to what we were doing on the construction side with regards to design professionals. We had them submitting pre-qualifications. Here we're having like a every few months, periodically opening it up to add more folks and have a defined list of attributes that they need to have for any given service. For this service we need this, for this we need this, and then also vetting them for like their KYC, know your customer practices, for their security practices, if they happen to be being investigated. That's a bigger one, but definitely relevant. And so then from that qualification list, we're able to maintain an approved list of blockchains that can utilize the stable token, and then firms that we would go to for services. And then from there, we would seek bids from those folks. And then having that continually operate and work and update it as time goes on. And we've started with, I don't remember how many originally, but we've gone from, there were like 5 or 6, and now there's like 10. And the idea being that, one, as more people grow interested and become aware of it, firms that maybe at first didn't bother, may apply, and those that didn't qualify, might change their practices and come to qualify. Another solution to some of our problems is the idea of having proprietary waivers, that there are times when, and I'm sure various versions of this exist in various states for lots of different things, but when we have a single entity, and this may come up a lot, we haven't issued it yet, but we'll see that there may be entities who are uniquely qualified for various reasons, for intellectual property reasons, or because they may have particular keys that we need for a given blockchain. That we can do a non-competitive negotiation or sole sourcing to make those instances work. And then finally, also looking to, emergency situations, making sure that our provisions for those are, flexible, that we're not just looking to instances of, like natural disasters, but also the less natural kind, like a hack, or equipment failure, or anything that might happen that would threaten, that's quote here, the solvency, security, or integrity of the stable token. Making sure that we are uniquely, flexible, at least in our state government, to respond to those instances, because it's one thing if like if your computer system gets hacked, that sucks. But if our system, once it gets going, gets hacked, that could potentially, it'd be devastating for the program. But these are, theoretically people who have put money who we'd owe to pay. And if somebody is able to access that, that would be extremely bad on a level that's not just, it's shut down, we can't operate for a few days, but like they could steal potentially millions or billions of dollars from us. And then also just to the point that I made about like, our website, making sure that they're like using other means and methods of getting the word out about what we're doing, like every public meeting, making a pitch, also social media, using the traditional public purchase, our procurement website, but also making sure that there are other ways to get these firms interested, because like I said, they're just not aware of it, or they weren't. They may now be. They're always traveling all over the world, a little jealous, to go to all these conferences and letting people know all about us. So we do get some interest from that. But yeah, that's what I wanted to share. Like I said, if you do have questions, you can ask them. But really, if they're technical, don't bother. I don't do that.